So what we're going to talk about in this video is SVG. And SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. And what it is, it's an image file format and a way to draw shapes with HTML style markup. The unique thing about SVG is, in addition to being able to draw images, relative to PNGs or GIFs or some of these other file formats, it's not pixel based. So when you zoom in on a PNG or a GIF or a JPEG, you'll notice that it gradually becomes more pixelized. SVGs work on a numeric description of the shapes you are using, hence the name Scalable Vector Graphics. You get good quality regardless of how far you might zoom in or zoom out. So let me give you an example of this. So right now we're looking at an SVG. So if I zoom in, notice we have relatively good quality. And here's a GIF of the same image. And initially, right off the bat, it's not the best quality, but when you zoom in, it becomes a lot worse. Now, SVG is an XML-based protocol in which the XML is used to create graphics that are rendered in the browser or other device. SVG images can be added to the browser similar to any other image. So let's take a look at that now. So here's the HTML source for the vector graphic that we're looking at. And if you notice, it's just a basic image tag with a source attribute pointing to the image that we're loading up. So pretty simple. So once you decide that you want to begin drawing shapes with SVG, the first thing you need to do is create an SVG element tag. This tag has to have two attributes, one that's a width and the other that's a height. The width and the height can be expressed in various values including centimeters, inches, and pixels, but the default is pixels, so we're going to be using that one. Once you've created your SVG tag and added the width and the height, the next thing you can begin doing is adding shapes. In our case, I've added a circle, and you can tell by the circle tag. So let's take a look at it. In addition to the circle tag, there's other default shapes that come with the SVG API. These include rect for rectangle, ellipse, line, polyline, polygon, and of course circle. So once you've created your circle, the first thing you probably want to do is to determine where you want this to be placed on the page. Well, in the case of the circle element, the CX and the CY determine the coordinates of the circle. So CX pushes the circle further to the right of the screen, and CY pushes the circle further down from the top of the screen. So let's take a look at that. The R attribute is simply the radius. So the bigger the radius, the bigger the circle. As you can probably tell, the fill attribute determines the color of our circle, and we can make it anything we want. If you would like to add an outline to the circle, you can do that as well by using the stroke attribute. So now that we've gone over the circle element, let's take a look at a few of the other shape elements. The first one that I have open is the rect element, which is short for rectangle. If you notice, the first two attributes of the rect element are width and height, which should be pretty self-explanatory. It's simply the width and the height of our rectangle. The next two elements might be a little bit confusing because they're the coordinate elements of our rectangle, and if you notice, they're different than the coordinate elements of the circle shape. instead of having CX and CY, we simply have X and Y. And I think the takeaway from that is to make sure that you don't assume anything prior to familiarizing yourself with any particular API. So the next shape is the line element, and as the name implies, the line element allows us to draw lines. The line element has two pairs of coordinates. The first pair simply determine where we would like our line to start, and the second pair determines where we would like our line to end. So we have x1, y1, which is where it starts, and we have x2 and y2, which is where it ends. So if I move some of these values, you can see the effect of them. Once you create your line, you can customize it further by using the stroke line cap attribute. This attribute has three different values: round, square, and butt. Right now it's set to round, hence why the line's ends are rounded. We can change this to see a different value, so let's try square. Now the line shape only allows you to connect 2 points. If you want to connect multiple points, you need to use a polyline element. Now with the polyline, if you look at the points attribute, this is where you specify how the line moves around the page. If you notice, the comma-separated values are in groups of 2. This is because the first value represents the x-coordinate and the second value represents the y-coordinate. Then there's a comma to separate these two coordinates, then the pattern repeats itself, and this is how you connect the line points. The stroke line join attribute is what determines the style by which the lines are connected. With this you have 3 choices: miter, round, and bevel. So let's take a look at all 3. Currently it's set to miter, so let's try round. And how about bevel? So one shape that we haven't talked about yet is the ellipse. And the ellipse is similar to the circle with one exception. You can change the horizontal and vertical axis of its radius using the Rx and Ry attributes. So for example, now if you want to create more complex shapes, you might want to use the polygon element. The unique thing about the polygon element is that it automatically closes off the shape for you. So if you look at our triangle, I have 100 and 100 as the first set of coordinates. That goes down to 200, 200, then back up and to the right at 300 and 0. If you notice, there isn't a fourth pair of coordinates because the shape automatically closes itself off. So one of the more unique things that you can do with SVG is you can animate shapes. So if you look at our code, we have a rect element, and then right below it, we have an animate element. So let's take a look at what this is doing. I'm going to refresh the browser. And our rect element just animated from left to right, and then it jumped back to where it was. So what's happening here? Well, we have an attribute called attribute name, and it has a value of x. And this is a coordinate position we've decided to animate. And then the next 2 attributes are from and to. And those basically say that we're going to take the x attribute and we're going to go from a particular value and to another value. So in this case, it's 0 to 300. The next attribute is the duration. And the duration is in seconds. So the duration is 3 seconds. If you notice, when we animated this, it actually jumps back to its initial place. We can change that by using the fill attribute with a value of freeze. So let me show you that. If you would like to repeat or loop an animation, you can do that as well by using the repeat count attribute, and then you set the value to the number of times you would like the animation to loop. If you would like it to loop indefinitely, you just use a value of indefinite. One of the more complicated elements in the SVG API is the path element. Now, the path element allows you to draw free-form paths based on a series of commands. The four most basic of these commands are M for move to, L for line to, H for horizontal line to, and V for vertical line to. Now these commands are values of the D attribute within the path element. So if you notice there's path, there's D, and then there's all the values. The D stands for data, so this is path data. So what does the path data in our case actually mean? Well, if you look at the screen, we have a triangle drawn to the browser, and the first value in our path data attribute is M00. Now the coordinates for that are 0, 0, which is the top left of the screen, and that means we're going to put our virtual pen down right there, and then we can draw a line anywhere we want. And the next value is L200, 200, which means we're going to go down and to the right 200 pixels, and we're going to draw a line there that connects to the initial pen drop. So that gives us our hypotenuse. And then the next thing that we're going to do is draw a line from 200 to 0. So we're going to keep the pen where we're at, and then we're just going to move up to 0. And then if you notice, that doesn't close off our shape. And what closes off our shape is the Z value. So Z closes off the shape. So one last thing before we move on, I changed the path data values for our triangle shape to a few different ones so we can get an idea of what those look like. So I have M00, which is our initial 0, 0 coordinate placement. Then I have H200. H stands for horizontal, so we go horizontally 200 pixels to the right. Then we have V200. V is for vertical, so we go down 200 pixels. And then we have Z, which closes off the shape. So there's an example of a few different values. In addition to the basic path data values that we've discussed, there's also an additional list of commands that are used for more complicated curves and drawings. These include C for curve 2, S for smooth curve 2, Q for quadratic Bezier curve, T for smooth quadratic Bezier curve 2. And for each one of these, there's more information available at the W3C specification. You can add various effects to SVG shapes, effects such as filters, blurs, and shadowing. The way that you do it is you start with the defs element. Defs stands for defines. The defs element is used to encapsulate other elements that are intended to only be triggered by a unique ID. So, for example, we have a filter element, and it has an ID called rEffectID. Inside of this filter element, we have another element that defines a particular effect, and in this case, it's a blur effect. Our filter ID is hooked to the element that we want to affect, and in this case, the element that we want to affect is our rect element. If you notice, there's an attribute called filter in our rect element. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a hashtag, and then I'm going to add the unique ID of the filter element that we have inside of our defs element. Now if you look at the result, it implements our blur effect, which is what we want. The main thing to understand is that in order to implement effects, you need to encapsulate them inside of a defs tag. Then you need to have an element with an ID that hooks to the shape that you want to affect. Now this concludes our lesson on SVG. The things that you should know by the end of the lesson are the following. You should understand what differentiates SVG from other image formats, and that unlike PNGs, GIFs, and JPEGs, SVG is a non-pixel based format that allows you to draw shapes directly in the browser. You should know what the SVG tag does and the two attributes it uses. You should be able to recognize the elements for the basic SVG shapes. You should know that it is possible to create animations and effects with SVG.